Make sure it's all working. Okay, it looks like we've got the connection. So we're almost ready to start. We'll just wait until the top of the hour. Spring has finally come here, almost a month late. We got a few people checking in. That's good. Okay. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhasa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhasa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhasa. So this week we're starting a new series. I'm going to do a series on the jhanas, and I thought I'd approach this a little differently. I'm not going to go through the jhanas in sequence as such. What I want to do is go through the hindrances and the jhana factors. There's a passage in the Visuddhimagga talking about this, and it pairs the jhana factors with the nivaranas, so that, for example, vitakka, applied thought, is the a counter to sloth and torpor, and so on. The specific hindrances are the counter to specific jhana factors. So there'll be 6 installments to this series, and I want to start today just making some general remarks to set the framework, and then we'll go into the detailed study of the factors starting next week. The first thing I'll say about the jhanas is that if any of you have done any amount of reading or listening to teachers and monks and others speaking about jhana, you may be feeling confused, because in my experience of any of the topics in Buddhism, there seems to be the most divergent views and different ways of talking about it and defining terms, and it can get quite confusing. So I'd like to set the framework by expressing how I understand the topic and the framework I use to think about it and to work with it. First of all, the definitions of first, second, third, fourth jhana, although useful, they I think are, in some ways, they can become a stumbling block if you take them too narrowly, and you will find a divergence in different teachers defining different states of mind as being first jhana. Another one I'll say no, that's access, concentration, and so on. So I think the most useful way to think about it from a practical point of view is not to be so focused on the precise divisions between the four jhanas, but to see the process as a spectrum, as a continuum, continually deeper and deeper samadhi. And the names of these different states, first, second, third, fourth jhana, could be defined by different people in different ways. That they mark signposts or stretches along the continuum, but it's always just deeper and deeper samadhi. The other, so that's one point I'd like to make right at the beginning, so that's so that you have an understanding of where I'm coming from. The other point I'd like to make is, I think, more important, is to think of jhanas as being not something extra, something that we're trying to gain that we haven't had before, something to attain. I don't think that's the most useful way to think of it, because you're not really producing anything new. I think it's better to think of the process as one of purification and simplification. That the mind, as it progresses into deeper samadhi and goes through the jhanas, is continually becoming simpler and, in a sense, more natural, more primordial. It's a natural mind when it's not cluttered. So we have the five nivarnas, the hindrances, and when those are made quiescent, when they're not present in the mind, then the mind naturally settles into its into this space that we call jhana. It's the nivarnas that keep us from experiencing jhana. The experience of jhana is actually a different level of consciousness. In the Abhidhamma, they talk about four planes or bhumis or levels of consciousness. There's the sense desire level, kama bhumi, which is the ordinary, you could say, the default state of mind of human beings. We're normally in this kama bhumi, which means more. It means more than sense desire. It means really sense experience. So that our consciousness is defined by and centered on the input from the senses. And our inner mental life is heavily influenced by this as well. Most of our thoughts, our desires, our fears revolve around sense objects. And this is a very complex state of mind. This level of consciousness is the most diverse and variegated and essentially confusing and bewildering in its complexity. So the mind is constantly being spun around. And it's the nivaranas essentially keep us in that vortex. So that's sense desire, ill will, sloth and torpor, restlessness, and skeptical doubt. And all of these keep the mind confused and uh, disturbed, agitated. You know? And when these states are made quiet, when they're settled, when they're not present in the mind, then the mind naturally settles into this deeper state of consciousness that that in Abhidhamma is called the Rupa Bhumi, or the realm of form, and this is a equivalent of jhana. It's called the realm of form just to distinguish it from the third, which is Arupa Bhumi, the formless realm, which are the four formless jhanas, and then the fourth level of consciousness is Nibbana. So we're making, when we actually transition into jhana, when the samadhi is deep enough, we're actually making a kind of phase shift or a quantum jump in consciousness. We have a different experience of consciousness that's not primarily based on the senses. Samadhi is the essential quality here. And samadhi should be defined as stillness or stability, non-wavering, non-moving of the mind. So the way to access deeper samadhi and jhana is samatha meditation. And the essential point of samatha meditation is that you start with an arbitrarily chosen object, like the breath. You know, you intend at the beginning of the meditation, you intend to pay attention to the breath or to a kasina or many other different kinds of objects. But usually in our tradition, we use the breath. And you try and fill the mind with the breath. You know, for a short time, it's very exhausting to the mind. The mind in jhana is not a narrow, constricted mind. It's vast and expansive, but it's still and non-moving. So the best way to think about the meditation is to make the mind calm, passive, and receptive, and let the breath fill the mind. One of the skills to learn in this type of meditation is the skill of non-attention, to disregard other phenomena that arise and impinge upon the mind, whether they're internal objects like thoughts and emotions, memories, or external objects like sounds or sensations in the body. The skill is to disregard them, to not let the attention wander towards them. And this is kind of the opposite of what you do in Vipassana meditation, where every object becomes momentarily the object of consciousness. So this is another thing I found with people. A lot of Western Buddhists have begun, and this is actually my case as well. I begun my meditation many years ago. The first meditation I learned was a Vipassana meditation in Mahasi tradition. And then that kind of sets up a difficulty in the mind when you switch gears and try to do samatha, because you kind of feel that you ought to be noticing the objects. So you develop this skill that you're clear in your mind that you're going to disregard the objects other than the chosen object, which is the breath, and just feel the sensation of the breath. And there's different ways of doing it. Traditionally, the most common way in most Theravada teaching is to pay attention to the breath at the nose tip. But you can also do it at the belly, or at the heart. But the essential thing is you have one seat of consciousness, and you're aware at through one sense gate. So you're feeling the breath. You're not watching the breath or listening to the breath. You're just feeling it, the sensation of touch. So the correct object here in breath meditation is tactile. It's the sense of touch at the nose, and you feel the breath passing in and out of the nose. And one should be uh, making an effort to uh, fill the consciousness with the sensation of breath. And what prevents that, what makes it difficult, is the presence of the niwaranas or hindrances. So you need to uh, be vigilant not to succumb to any of the five hindrances. And we'll talk about them in sequence in the next five talks, and how each one is uh, overcome or countered by one of the jhana factors. And this theme of purification and simplification carries on throughout the jhanas. It's a very important uh, a very important aspect or a way of understanding is that each jhana is progressively simpler, less complex. The mind is simplifying itself, returning to a more natural state. And the first jhana is marked by five factors, and the second jhana by three, and the third by two, and the fourth also by two. And we have in the third jhana, the two factors are sukha or bliss and ekaggata or unification of mind. And in the fourth jhana, the bliss is substituted for the simpler, more natural, more primordial state of upekkha or equanimity. So this means, as I said before, it's not something new that's being gained or added to the mind. On the contrary, it's quite the opposite. It's peeling away layers and allowing the more natural, the deeper state of mind to naturally express itself. And if the hindrances are made quiescent, if they're absent in the stream of consciousness, the mind will naturally, without difficulty, sink into deeper samadhi and into jhana. So in the initial beginning of the practice, it's important to be vigilant against the arising of the nivaranas. Jhana meditation is very central to the way the Buddha taught. And in fact, we find in Pali, in the language, when you read it in translation and you see the verb to meditate, that usually is translating the Pali verb janeti, which means to do jhana. So there's an equivalency between meditating and jhana that shows up in the Pali language. And in the expansion of the Eightfold Noble Path, the path factor of Samma Samadhi, the eighth path factor, is defined as being first, second, third, and fourth jhana. So if anyone thinks that jhana practice is somehow peripheral to central teachings, they're quite mistaken. It was very central to the Buddhist teaching. I should maybe say something here about the relationship between samadhi and panya. or Samatha and Vipassana. That as this question often comes up in one form or another. And one of the famous sayings of Ajahn Chah is samadhi makes panya and panya makes samadhi. That wisdom and uh, samadhi are, in a sense, two sides of the same stick. That was another saying of Ajahn Chah's, that they're two sides of the same stick. Um, there has been, and it's not entirely a modernist conceit, although it's taken off in modern times, an idea of bare insight. Just doing some form of rigorous vipassana without any prior work in samadhi. And the argument or the feeling of the proponents of this method is that it saves time. You just get right to the core right away. And there probably are some gifted individuals who can uh, make progress that way. But experience shows that for most people, trying to do proper vipassana without any grounding in samadhi is very difficult. The mind is so cluttered and confused and spun around that it becomes almost impossible to pin down the specific objects. So the more samadhi you can develop, even if it's not quite to the point of jhana, the more samadhi you can develop, the better you will do with developing insight. The easier it will be, the less painful, the smoother it will be. In the suttas, the Buddha talks about various different meditative paths to full awakening, and there's quite a. He did present several different kind of variations, but the one that he seemed to talk about the most is going through first, second, third, and fourth jhana, and then on emergence from jhana, uh, going into investigation or insight. This is because it makes the mind at that moment is the most malleable, the most workable. You know? One analogy that is often used is that uh, comparing meditation to uh, working with a tool like a chisel. Samatha meditation is like sharpening the chisel, and the vipassana is like doing the work with the chisel. If you start to try and to carve something with a dull chisel, it's not going to be very effective. It's not going to be a very beautiful result, and it's going to be very painful and difficult for you to do. On the other hand, if all you do is ever sharpen the chisel, you're never going to do anything useful. So that you have to have some balance of both. It's also for those who take an interest in Abhidhamma, there's also a principle in Abhidhamma that there's no Maggapala without jhana. Maggapala, path and fruit, is the technical description of the moment of full awakening or enlightenment in Abhidhamma. So the advocates of the bare insight tradition like Mahasi Sayadaw in his writings, and I have a very high regard for Mahasi Sayadaw. That's how I actually started with his teachings, and I still have a very deep interest and respect in that approach. He taught basically a bare insight tradition, but he says in his writings that the meditator who attains Magapala must have at least one moment, one mind moment of jhana. The mind will come together in jhana for a moment before uh, experiencing uh, the emergence into nibbana. So they can't get away, even the pure insight people can't get away from jhana altogether. No? The Buddha in the suttas actually does mention, as I said, many variations, and he does mention bare insight without elaborating. It's just briefly mentioned as one of the possible ways of becoming enlightened. So the reasons to practice samatha meditation, and we've been talking now about the one of the reasons, perhaps, or the I would say certainly the most profound and important reason is to prepare the mind for uh, deep insight and emergence of wisdom. But the Buddha also praised it as a pleasant abiding here and now, the blameless pleasure divorced from the senses. So it's a pleasant abiding here and now, meaning it just it feels good, and there's no downside to it. It's just uh, a deep, profound well-being and happiness that is only beneficial. So the next 5 weeks, I'm going to go through the list of the hindrances paired with the jhana factors, and I've decided to go through it in the order of the jhana factors, so it'll be different than the ordinary order of the nivaranas. You know, for those of you who are conversant with the literature, but I think it will be an approach that may shed some new may be looking at familiar ground from a new angle, maybe helpful. So I'll stop there and take questions. Let me go to the chat and see if there's anything already in the chat to be spoken about. Okay, question here. Oh, the questions. This usually happens with talks on jhana. The questions come fast and furious. So, first question, Ajahn, the metrics to define jhana seem controversial, with definitions ranging from a mild peacefulness to deep states of ekagata, where access to sensory experience is lost. What is your opinion? Yeah, well, that's what I started out initially saying, that you'll find many, many different divergent views and definitions of jhana. And rather than try and reconcile them or decide which is correct, I prefer the approach of just thinking of it as a spectrum of deeper and deeper samadhi, and then the uh, divergent definitions and debates become merely semantic. It's how you arbitrarily choose to define this stretch as first jhana. Somebody else says, no, that's not. That's actually, you're already in second jhana. Someone says, no, you're not even there. You're not even at first jhana. But there's this particular moment, state of mind that has some degree of samadhi, and how we define it is not really so important. It's just deepening that samadhi and uh, becoming more and more unified in the mind. And the question of the, removal from the sense bases, that becomes progressively stronger as one moves through the jhanas. The first jhana is already quite divorced from the senses, but there's a saying. I think it's in the Visuddhimagga. I can't recall exactly the source, but there's a saying that says, "Sound is a thorn to first jhana," and what that means is that in first jhana, one is separated from the senses, but just barely. Right? So a loud sound or a sudden sound can impinge on the mind and disturb the jhana and make you fall from that state to a lower state of mind, going back into sense consciousness. As you go into second and third jhana, the senses are further and further away, and there's less impact to the senses. There's a story in the Mahaparinirvana Sutta of the Buddha meditating in his last days. Uh, he said he was only free of pain in his body when he was in fourth jhana, and he was meditating beside the road in fourth jhana when a big thunderstorm broke out, a monsoon uh, thunderstorm and pelting rain, and that came and went, and then a caravan of 500 elephants, a merchant caravan with 500 elephants, came stomping down the road past him. And then when he emerged from jhana, people asked him about it. He said he wasn't aware of either event. He was so divorced from the sense consciousness that even very strong sense impressions like that did not impinge on his mind. Uh, Next question. I saw a sphere with white side and black clouds surrounding it. Is it a jhanic sphere? I saw after infinite consciousness. I was raptured. Yeah, this could be what technically is called a nimitta. Um, that's a whole interesting topic to talk about too. Just talk about it briefly here. For um, many meditators will have uh, a visual appearance in the field of consciousness, and what this questioner describes sounds very much like a classic type of nimitta. It can be, and it can vary from things like a jewel or something that looks like a planet or a star or just a bright disk. Um, and if you read the Visuddhimagga, the recommendation when a nimitta arises is to take that as the object uh, of focus and make that the object of your meditation, and unify the mind on that. And if you can do that, that's well and good. And when a nimitta arises, as this questioner describes, it would be well worth the experiment to try and see if you can stabilize a nimitta by focusing on it. But what many people find is that in practice is that they are unable to do so, that the nimitta comes and goes, fades in and out, changes shape, changes color, moves around. And then you're not going to get a unified mind. And you're better to just go back to the breath and ignore the nimitta. If you focus on the nimitta, you're no longer doing breath meditation. You're now doing nimitta meditation, which if you can manage it. So some people have this faculty of strong visualization and some don't. And I think these days it's more people don't. Um, so you can, my recommendation with the nimitta is to give it a go, experiment with it, see if you can stabilize it. If after giving it a decent period of time of trying to stabilize it, you cannot do so, then give up on it and just stay with the breath. And when the nimitta arises, just treat it as any other distraction and disregard it. I was watching your Buddhist cosmology video when this happened. How do I know it wasn't a hallucination? Oh, that's a follow-up from the last question. Well, what's a hallucination? it's a visual perception. Everything is a hallucination in some sense. It's created by our perception. Uh, my initial comments would apply. It wouldn't arise. Another thing I could say about that is the nimitta wouldn't arise if you didn't have some decent amount of samadhi. So it's a good sign to have one arise. Okay, next question. How would you describe the hallmarks of experience that define first jhana, features that would allow an individual to know they may be in that territory? Thank you. Um, I would say primary thing as a kind of a defining factor is absence of the awareness. So if you find yourself distracted in any, particularly the two sense desire and ill will, which means you're engaged in the senses in some way. So if you're sitting in meditation and you're feeling irritated by, you know, the seat is too hard, or there's a fly buzzing in the room, or something like that, then an ill will, that's a very subtle, even it's just a very subtle ill will arising, then that you can't be by any definition in jhana. Likewise, if you're find yourself interested in things of the senses, sounds, or even just the feeling of coolness or warmth, that's also subtle forms of sense desire, and you're going out through the senses. With jhana, the mind is entirely internal. There's no going out through the senses. Now, as I mentioned about the divorce from the senses is not 100% complete in first jhana. You might still have some impingement, but the real question is, how much does the mind take any interest in it? The mind should disregard anything coming in from the outer senses, and the separation from the senses will become deeper and deeper until they're no longer evident at all. Um, there should be very little thought process going on. Thought process doesn't really cease entirely until second jhana. That's a defining factor of second jhana. But the thinking should be very quiet and subtle, and a decent amount interval of time between thoughts, not a constant jumble. And the attention on the object should be very strong and steady. Is next question: is the dry insight path the same as pointing the mind to the mind itself? No, no. I would say you're the kind of well, they kind of lead to the same place. When you say the pointing the mind to the mind itself, that is one of the routes to wisdom. It's the way that's often spoken about in some branches of the Thai forest tradition, particularly starting with Ajahn Mun, that you center the mind on the chitta. You just be in the chitta, the knowing. Uh, it's kind of an interesting dichotomy here uh, between that Thai forest approach and the Burmese Vipassana approach, and they're both going to the same place from different directions. In the Burmese Vipassana approach, it's the focus is all on the objects of consciousness, to be aware of precisely of the different objects. And in the Thai forest approach, the emphasis is on the knowing mind itself. But they end up, in the end, if they're done well, they end up being the same thing. Because if you're centered in the knowing mind, then the objects will of themselves become crystal clear. And if you make the objects really precisely clear, then you're naturally centered in the knowing mind to do that. So it's really more of a two different approaches to the same state of mind. Next question. In lucid dreams, if one has experienced the formless mind only, no body, coming out of a former self and also going in and out of bodies of others, would that be memory of the formless realm? It could be. I mean, we can't ever be definitive about such things. I think it is very possible and even somewhat common to have bits and pieces of memories of past lives come up in dreams, more or less confused and muddled up with experience from this life. But that can include experiences from other realms of existence. Next one. Viktaka Vichara, can you talk a little about this topic and how it applies to jhana practice? Yeah, we are going to go through that in the next couple of weeks. Vittaka is, I'll just very briefly summarize it here. Vittaka is the striking of the object with the mind, and Vichara is the holding of the object with the mind. So Vichara is the deeper, more subtle faculty. So that should be emphasized. But whenever the mind wavers, it's losing its attention to the object, then you need to apply vittaka and strike the object. But if you keep constantly striking the object, then the mind it's disturbing to the mind. It's difficult. Do you know how Venerable Nana Vira Terra felt about jhana? No, I don't recall. I did read years ago. I read most of Nana Vira's stuff. I don't recall him talking about jhana. I'm sure he did. I don't. I don't. My someone may correct me on this, but my feeling is he couldn't have said anything too radical, or I would remember it as. I think it was, if he said anything at all, it would be in the mainstream on that topic. I'm not sure. Ajahn, how do upachara and apana samadhi relate to jhana? The Visuddhimagga uses these terms. They're not found in the EBT. Yeah. I think, if you go, this is a criticism I have of the Visuddhimagga approach, is that it tends to be too cut and dried, and it doesn't really relate so much to living experience as to a kind of a theoretical model. And I never use those terms in my own teaching or talking about jhana. I don't find them so useful. They're neighborhood and access concentration. That's how they're usually defined. It's like it's supposed to be a state of mind that's nearly in jhana. And I think that this goes back to my initial comments about being overly literalist or narrow in definitions, and when you're sort of like really chopping up that continuum too fine to try and define, this is upachara, this is apana, this is samadhi, this is jhana. And obviously, if we're talking about it, jhana as being a continuum or a spectrum, there's going to be a place on that spectrum that's almost jhana, that's not quite jhana, but is getting there. But to precisely define it is not. I don't think it's either useful or really practical. Could you please articulate the difference between jhanas discussed today versus vipassana jhanas? I don't know any reference to vipassana jhanas in the suttas. No, there is no reference to vipassana jhanas. That's a term that, as far as I know, was introduced by Upandita, Mahasi Sayadaw's successor, and even Mahasi Sayadaw never used it. It's a way of trying to relate the stages of insight to the jhanas, and it may be useful as a conceptual tool, um, but no, it doesn't have any scriptural basis at all. Okay, I heard there is a difference between the mind is absorbed in jhana and where the mind is observer. E.g., in sixth jhana, how can a mind observe infinite consciousness if the mind is not in a position as an observer? Yeah, that kind of question, you're getting um, too caught up in the technic, the technical descriptions um, and the theory rather than the actual experience. The sixth jhana, for those who are not aware, or the second formless jhana, is um, the base of infinite consciousness. Um, and the way to experience those, to get to even just to have a glimpse of those formless jhanas, is to actually try uh, to take that simplification and purification into that level. So from ordinary consciousness, simplify it and abstract it to the point where you're only aware of space. You remove objects and you're just aware of space. And at that moment, there's consciousness filling space. Then you cease to pay attention to space, and all that's left is consciousness. You know? And trying to talk about it or describe it, you're going to come up into paradoxes and become sort of impossible the way the questioner phrases it. Uh, the best way is to just try and do it and see what happens when the infinite consciousness is filling space. What does it feel like when space is removed and there's just consciousness? Next question. As I understand it, different people have a propensity towards different hindrances, ill will, etc. Do they have a role in the type of meditation we select? Yeah, they do. Yes, and there's a whole big section in the Visuddhimagga about personality types and um, recommended practices and so on. Someone who's, as a general, there's a lot could be said about this, but it's a kind of general point. Um, Someone whose primary defilement is sense desire, sensual type person, they should be doing things like meditation on the 32 parts of the body or corpse meditation, uh, like that. Someone whose primary defilement is ill will, like angry type or uh, nasty, hateful type, they should be doing metta meditation, loving kindness. Okay. Oh, so somebody must have just put something in the chat, jumped on me. I got to find my spot again. It feels as though anytime I adjust factors or energy or I'm mindful, I am bringing the self into the experience. How can I navigate between what is mindful observer and what is delusion of self? Um, that's actually a very good question. That it's good that you're noticing that it's a subtle form of self making. That you're getting involved in those factors in the wrong way. Um, if say you notice the energy level is too high, and if you're thinking, "Oh, I'm too energized, I'm getting restless," that's the wrong way of thinking of it. The better way to look at it is energy is increasing, restlessness is increasing. To objectify the factors, don't identify them as a self, as a me and mine. Okay. Next question. When I get very concentrated, I feel like gears opening in my head. Grr, grr, grr. Or sometimes this feeling of having two concentric bodies with the outer body going around the inner body. Should I continue to ignore this experience or use it as an object? Um, I would I would not use something as kind of complex as that as the object. I think that um, that'll just keep you kind of stuck at that level. I would just let it settle out. Don't try to fight it. Just disregard it. Let it go on in the background until it fades away. Ajahn Dunn, a Thai Kruba Ajahn, teaches Upachara Samadhi is adequate for stream entry, and the Thai tradition believes jhana is a deeper state than Upachara. However, the suttas state that jhana is essential for stream entry. How do you reconcile these? Do you think Upachara Samadhi may equate to first jhana of the suttas? Yeah, it's again getting caught up in these definitions. Um, I think it is clear from the Abhidhamma at least. It's clear that uh, the mind must be unified to the point of jhana to experience stream entry. Um, but there's also a paradox here in that the mind that's in jhana cannot experience stream entry. But it has to, it's like a prerequisite, a precursor. And in the bare insight tradition, as I say, they sometimes talk about, having just a moment of jhana and then going into Magapala. Um, and as far as saying Upachara Samadhi is adequate for stream entry, and others say that first jhana is, this again is a kind of a semantic distinction. What exactly are you defining as Upachara Samadhi? There certainly has to be, for stream entry to occur, there would have to be a very deep samadhi. So the more samadhi you have, the better. Okay, if someone had a vision of great Brahma, would that be this vision the same for everyone? Would he look the same or take different forms? I would say it would take different forms because when you have, if anybody has a vision of some uh, celestial level of consciousness, like the great Brahma, Mahabrahma, uh, it's going to be filtered through your own perception. Uh, it's like your mind acts like a kind of a distorting lens. So someone who's been grown up, raised in Thailand, and so on, if they have a vision of the Dewas, they'll look like the Dewas on the Thai temple walls, which are different than the way the Sri Lankans draw them. Someone in Sri Lanka would see them a little differently, and someone who was raised in a Catholic country would see them as angels. So I think there can be an external source and then the internal filtering by your perception. Is it true that for jhana, one should consider using a concept as the object, like the breath? Is it true that for jhana, one should consider using a concept as the object, like the breath as in and out, instead of the touch or temperature? Is more related to vipassana? Can you comment? I would say that the important thing is that you limit your object to a single sense base. And I think the most common way of doing anapanasati or breath meditation is the sense of touch. So that's not a concept. Now you can use a concept as a meditation object, which is what we do in, say, metta meditation. This is the concept or feeling of loving kindness. But breath meditation, it's the tactile sense of touch. So it's not really even temperature. It's the, I would say, touch or pressure on the nose tip. When I try to meditate, I become ultra aware of any itchiness, which makes it difficult to sit still. I have to itch, or the sensation grows and grows and overpowers the experience. What can I do? Um, yeah, that sounds like you're really caught in something there. It's obviously, psychosomatic. There's no physical reason why meditation should make you itchy. And it depends somewhat on what meditation you're doing. If you're doing a samatha meditation, um, you should uh, you should be able to. It may be difficult at first, but you should be able to remove your attention from the itchiness and just get lost in the sense of breath, or just focus entirely on the sense of the breath and let the itchiness fade into the background by ignoring it. Um, with vipassana meditation, you can take it as an object and observe the itchiness. If you keep giving into it and scratching, it'll keep coming back. It's kind of a trap you're caught in. You have to. It'll be difficult at first, but you can get through it. Okay, so we're getting close to the hour, so I think we'll wrap it up. And next time we're going to do the first jhana factor, which is with taka, and the uh, hindrance on the opposite side related to that is tinamida, or sloth and torpor. So we'll do that for the next 5 weeks. We'll do every week. We'll do a jhana factor and a hindrance paired. Okay, I'll take my leave, and thank you all for coming, and hope to see you again.